You're listening to The Bill Bennett Show.
As we change direction a little, I am very happy, and you will be happy, to have some time with Niall Ferguson, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He's a historian and a best-selling author. The new book is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook. Niall Ferguson is taking a look at the collision between old power hierarchies and social networks. I don't know if you remember me. I moderated a debate between you and Jared Diamond at a Milken conference a few years ago. Do you recall that? I do
indeed, and it's good to be reconnected with you after all these years, and a pleasure to have a chance to talk.
Any comment on the difference between Harvard and Stanford?
Apart from the weather?
Yeah, apart from the weather, yeah.
I mean, the biggest difference that strikes one is that computer science and engineering are so much more dominant than Harvard that it's really more like MIT as an institution than it is like Harvard, even although they're kind of in competition for the same elite students. It's also a slightly more flexible institution. I'm finding you can get stuff done here a lot faster than you could at Harvard.
The Square and the Tower. Niall Ferguson, what's the Square and what's the Tower? And give us an example of each from old and new.
Well, if you went to Tuscany on vacation and visited the town of Siena, you'd see a wonderful juxtaposition of a square and a tower. The central Piazza del Campo, the central town square, is where the local people meet, converse, sometimes even play sports like horse racing. And then overshadowing it is the Torre del Mangia, this very tall tower that dates back to the 1300s, which was really the headquarters of the government of the Sienese Republic. And I chose the square and the tower for the title of the book, because what I wanted to convey to people is that throughout history there has been this interplay between the square and the tower. In other words, between social networks that we engage in informally and structures of power, states and all kinds of government really, which try to control what goes on in the town square. That's the central theme of the book, and the contemporary equivalent of the square and the tower is the square of online social networks of the world of Facebook and Google, and the tower of established power in Washington, D.C., or for that matter in New York City. I end the book with an allusion to the contrast between the Facebook campus, which is rather like a giant square, and Trump Tower in New York City.
Does the square always, often, usually challenge the tower?
Not always. In most of history, the tower has the upper hand. I mean, we as a species tend to organize ourselves hierarchically. Tribes and clans, early human organizations tend to have a chief. And for most of history, the square is pretty much under the control of the tower wherever you look. But sometimes, just occasionally in history, and maybe because of a technological change, the square can get the upper hand and can challenge the forces of authority in the tower. And it's no coincidence that revolutions often start in squares. Think Tahrir Square in Egypt not so long ago, or the Maidan in Kiev in Ukraine. So I'm interested in those moments when the square challenges the tower. Those are the moments of disruption. We have certainly witnessed them in our own time. But I think to understand exactly the ways in which the internet and social media are disrupting established hierarchies, you need to go back in history and see when it's happened before.
You talk about the priesthood of believers as an example of the square's aspiration as well as its power. Is that right?
Right. So when Martin Luther launched his challenge to the Roman Catholic hierarchy back 501 years ago, his vision was that if only he could connect ordinary people directly to God by giving them the power to read the Bible for themselves in those newly printed editions that were becoming available at that time, then you might just get the priesthood of all believers that the Bible talks about. But of course, that's not what happened. What happened was a tremendous polarization of European society between those who bought Luther's message and joined his Reformation, became Protestants, and those who opposed it, regarded it as heretical, and formed a counter-Reformation to challenge it. And I think something somewhat similar has happened in our own time. People in Silicon Valley love talking about how if everybody is connected on their networks, then there will be a global community. That's a favorite phrase of Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg. But I don't see that global community right now. What I see is a similar story to the one of the 16th and 17th century of ideological polarization. And if you look on these network platforms today, whether it's Facebook or Twitter for that matter, it's really striking how incredibly polarized they've become. So I don't think we're any more likely to create a global community in our time of the internet than Martin Luther was to create a priesthood of all believers with the help of the printing press 500 years ago.
Is the square aspirational in a way that the tower isn't? I mean, the tower can be established structures of authority, inherited structures of authority. The government can be the divine right of kings, I assume. Is there something about the square and the network, people gathering in the square, to stay with the metaphor, that is aspirational, that somehow believes that it will make things better, improve things?
I don't think that's exclusively a phenomenon of social networks, because often the most powerful hierarchical rulers have claimed that they're going to make the world a better place. They don't often succeed in doing that. But I think we human beings like to say that we have high-minded, even utopian ambitions. The question is not who has the higher ambition. I think the question is who controls whom. Most of the time it's possible for strong governments to control social networks. And I give the example of Stalin's Soviet Union, a system so centralized with so much power in the hands of one man that even a chance encounter between two people, not even a large crowd, but between two people, could arouse Stalin's suspicion and lead to the persecution of one of those people. So we realize, I think, looking back, that there's a kind of continuum from that level of incredible centralization and hierarchical rule to, at the other extreme, a completely decentralized system of the sort that now exists online. I mean, the population of Facebook, if Facebook were a country, is now larger than that of China. It's more than 2 billion people.
Right.
And although Mark Zuckerberg is the chief executive of the company, the extent of his control over ordinary Facebook users seems to the Facebook users to be minimal. Most people on Facebook don't feel that they're under his control, even if their news feed does in fact represent or reflect Mark Zuckerberg's carefully contrived algorithm.
One last historical question, because you talk about the printing press. Was the printing press as revolutionary at the time as the internet is now? I remember hearing from a professor of mine many years ago, I don't know if the story's true, you may know, is that one objection to the printing press was someone in authority said, my God, they'll all be able to read.
Well, of course, the reality of life in 1517, when Luther launched his Reformation with the help of the printing press, was that relatively few people could read, and indeed literacy was the preserve of the elite. One of the unintended consequences of the Reformation, because it made printed matter available in a way that written manuscripts hadn't been, was that literacy surged. Any country that embraced Luther's teaching, or Calvin's for that matter, any of the countries that went Protestant, saw their literacy rate rapidly rise. And that, in that sense, the Reformation had all kinds of unintended consequences, because, of course, when you can read one book, you can read any book. And it wasn't long before the printing presses of Europe and later Europe's colonies in the New World were producing everything conceivable, tracts on science, tracts on political philosophy, all kinds of different things were being published, so that by the 18th century, the printing press wasn't just responsible for spreading religious teaching, it was spreading every conceivable kind of knowledge. And that was, I think, one of the greatest revolutions in all history. Every single major idea between 1500 and 1800 is an idea generated and spread by the network of printing presses.
Yeah. This book we're talking about with its author, Niall Ferguson, is The Square and the Tower, Networks and Power. All right, let's jump right into today. I'm inside the a beltway. I'm in the swamp. I guess maybe I'm a swamp creature, have been for a while. And anyway, there is a debate going on, and I've been involved in it. I've talked to both sides. I've talked to people at Facebook. I've talked to people at the White House. There's thoughts about regulating Facebook, treating it like a utility. Is this an example of the tower trying to get control of the square?
Well, I think it is. It's a classic case, really, since it became clear to people in the swamp in Washington, D.C., that Facebook and companies like it, Twitter, Google, are now the most important media companies in practice in America. We've had a pretty heated debate about what to do about that. Now, people on the left, as you know, are attracted to antitrust and would like to break up the big companies. I don't think that idea is going very far, and not just because the Democrats are out of power. I don't think it gets very far in the courts. If you try antitrust against Amazon, Jeff Bezos is going to say, show me the harm I do consumers, and I'll break up my company. The case won't last 2 days. The other issue, which I think Republicans need to concern themselves with, is really whether you have a level regulatory playing field. Because at the moment you don't. At the moment, under mid-1990s legislation going back to the Communications and Decency Act, Section 230, there is an exemption granted to the big technology companies. They are classified as network platforms, not publishers of content, and therefore they're not liable for the content that appears on their platforms. And that has given a massive advantage to Facebook and Google versus conventional publishers of content, because in effect, they aggregate everybody else's content and collect the advertising revenue for posting it. Now, I think that's indefensible. You don't need to be for and against or against regulation on this issue. It's just a question of whether we have consistent regulation. And I think 2016 revealed the dangers of having this exemption, because essentially anything went on Facebook. Fake news went on Facebook. The Russians were able to advertise on Facebook in ways that I think had at least some impact on the public conversation. And I don't see how we can allow that to happen in future elections. Right now, Facebook and the other tech companies say, we can fix this. We'll self-regulate. Don't you do anything, Washington? But I think if politicians simply accept that self-regulation is going to be enough, they're in for a big surprise, because Facebook, Google, and the others are really much too powerful now to be left simply to regulate themselves.
The reason I asked about aspirational earlier, again, we're talking to Niall Ferguson and the book, The Square and the Tower, is this quote, which is right here in your media material. I thought once everybody could speak freely and exchange information and ideas, the world was automatically going to be a better place. I was wrong about that. And that's from a co-founder of Twitter. And there are many things said by Mark Zuckerberg and others, in similar positions, about that opening up this communication, this worldwide square, and letting people talk to people all over the place would obviously reaffirm common humanity and make the world better. Not clear that it has. Is that right?
I think we were told, going right back to the 1990s, that if everybody was connected, everything would be awesome. That was the Kool-Aid that was served up on a regular basis in Silicon Valley. And we still hear it because it's a regular theme of Mark Zuckerberg's speeches that he's building a global community that will solve all the world's problems. And the point I'm trying to make in The Square and the Tower is be careful what you wish for, because if you create giant online social networks, you should expect anything but a happy, clappy global community. History tells you that you're much more likely to get polarization, crazy stuff going viral, network attacks of the sort that we saw in 2016 on both the Democratic Party and the Trump campaign. So I think it's naive to imagine that if we're all connected, the world is just going to magically solve climate change and inequality and all the rest of it. It's much more likely, in my view, that creating a public sphere like this is going to destabilize democracy unless we do something about it.
The Square and the Tower raises some very interesting questions about contemporary issues, as well as a great history lesson. I think Ferguson is a magnificent teacher. Some problem interfered with our conversation at that point, so we had to leave it there. We may wish to conclude it at a later date. Please feel free to share the podcast on all your social media pages. Follow me on Twitter at William J. Bennett, and you can find me on Facebook. Just search Bill Bennett and like the page. Thanks for listening. We'll talk next week.